Before we start, a quick favour. If you're getting value from Rev-n-u Unplugged, take 10 seconds to hit subscribe. It makes a massive difference and helps us bring on more brilliant guests. Right, here's something that will make you rethink how you approach deals. Most sellers think negotiation starts when you're vendor of choice, when it's contract time, when you're talking price. Marcin has spent 25 years in enterprise software, proving negotiation starts in conversation number one. And the sellers who get this, well, they're closing bigger deals faster and with better terms. In this episode, Joe breaks down 3 critical topics for 2026. His incredible give-get framework for negotiation from day one, creating winning cultures, not pizza Fridays, real accountability frameworks, and selecting winners, why skills can be taught but qualities cannot. The 3 non-negotiables, curiosity, creativity, and grit. Plus his fail fast framework that gets new hires to fly or self-select out within 90 days. Proper tactical stuff for any sales leaders heading into 2026. So grab a brew, settle in, and let's get into it. This is Rev-n-u Unplugged with Joe Marcin.
Joe, welcome to Rev-n-u Unplugged. I appreciate you taking time out from your day to join us for this episode. We've got 3 exciting topics to dive into, and I think they're quite important topics for 2026. The art and science of negotiating, it's a winning culture, and selecting winners. As I ask all my guests to do before we get going on those topics, if you could just give the audience a bit of background as to who Joe is.
Sure, James. Thanks very much for inviting me to join today. I'm excited to chat through the topics with you. Just by way of background, I've been in enterprise software for the last 25 years. And for the last 10 years, I've been in revenue leadership roles in private equity sponsored businesses. I'm really focused on value creation for customers, for employees, and for shareholders. I've had experience working with the Office of the CFO, the Office of the CRO, the Office of the CMO, the Office of Operations, lots of different parts of the business across a lot of different types of industries. So excited to talk about what talent means to success and also the art and science behind negotiation and ultimately how we arrive at great outcomes.
Let's dive straight into the art and science of negotiation. I think it's often a topic that gets overlooked. It's if you are a good negotiator, it's not just about pounds, shilling, and pence, which a lot of people think it is. But before we get into what art and science of negotiation is, for you, when does negotiation start and why is that important to you?
For me, it actually starts from the very first conversation. A lot of sales athletes think about the negotiation as something that happens once you're vendor of choice. You've gone through an evaluation cycle, a customer has selected you as their preferred solution, and now the negotiation begins. And I think that's a misnomer. I think the negotiation actually starts from the very first conversation. When you approach a customer, a prospective customer, you have a point of view on how you can impact their business in a positive way. Ultimately, they're going to probably ask you for something. Send me a white paper, send me some customer examples, show me a demo, whatever it might be. That is your first opportunity to establish what I call a give-get framework with that customer. They're asking for something. What are you getting in return? It doesn't always have to be something monetized as a dollar value, but it has to be something of value to you as the sales athlete leading that campaign to ultimately help solve this problem for the customer. So in my opinion, the negotiation starts from conversation number 1.
And the give-get we'll go into in a bit more detail as well. But why is it important that early on to you that people are thinking about negotiation as a two-way street and that it's happening that early?
Because it's subtle. At that point in the relationship, the customer doesn't see it as a negotiation. They don't see themselves kind of like the classic sales athlete. They don't see themselves at vendor of choice. Now I need to go into the negotiation of the commercials and the contract structure. And so for them, there's not a lot of pressure. There's not a lot of focus on the negotiation itself. But essentially what you're doing is you're setting the table for that. You're establishing that power differential between you and the customer and ultimately putting yourselves as equals in that relationship. That's really, really important to not only establish up front, but to preserve throughout the duration of that relationship. A lot of times customers will ask you to do things that require time, resources, energy. And if they're asking that of you, you have to remember that what you bring to the table is of value to them. And therefore you need to be thinking about what are you getting in return as you exchange.
So how do you set the scene at the get-go, particularly when customers are asking for information? And as a salespeople, most of them will be like, yeah, I just want to get you that information so that we can move through the process. They're desperate to get to what we would normally class the negotiation point when we're talking about money. So how do you set the scene to your sellers that it's okay to ask for something in return, particularly when rapport might not be as great as it is further down the line with the people that they're talking to? So how do you encourage them to set the landscape to be able to ask for things in return?
Well, before any interaction with a customer, I encourage all the people on my team to really think about what is it that creates a great outcome. How do you define success in this particular interaction? And they might say, well, success is agreement on a next step. Success is access to another stakeholder. Success is we get selected and we get to move into a contract negotiation. Great. But they have a point of view on what success looks like in each and every interaction. And so when the customer says, in your example, James, please send me some more information, the seller should already have a point of view on what they're going to ask for in return. Okay, Mr. and Mrs. Customer, I'm happy to send that to you. But in order for me to do that, I first need to calendar our next appointment. Can we take a look at schedules for next week and get that set up? So the ask is not very large, but it's balanced with what the ask of the customer is, right? They've asked for some information. Okay, in exchange for that, I'm asking for the next call.
And how do you then coach salespeople of what the negotiation is and what, when they've asked for something, what you can ask for in return? Because I think that might be somewhere where salespeople are lacking.
Yeah, I agree. Part of it's mindset. Part of it is really building conviction that what you do matters and working with your teams to make sure that they truly believe that. Once you establish the right mindset around the fact that what we do matters and that we actually can help these companies with solving whatever the business problem is that our technology and solutions solve, then it's really figuring out what are the various asks that we want in exchange for the customer's ask. So usually what we'll do is we'll sit down and we'll think through, it's like a call planner, but we'll sort of think through, here are the possible things that we think a customer might ask for at this stage in the relationship. And if they ask for A or B or C, we're going to ask for A, B, or C in return. And of course, you should have more than one option, because you may ask for something in return and the customer say, I would love to do that, but I can't really do that today. Okay, well, would you be able to do this instead? So you should always be prepared with what that initial ask is. Also, what your secondary and tertiary asks might be, should a customer not be able to fulfill the first one that you have.
And so let's break it down into the two. You mentioned the art and science behind negotiation. Let's look at science. So when it comes to negotiation, when you say science, what do you mean?
For me, the science part is really what I just described. It's having that sort of plan, right? It's not winging it. It's not showing up to the call or the meeting with the customer and not really knowing what you're going to ask for. It's having a very thoughtful, intentional point of view on what you're going to ask for and what you expect the customer to be asking from you in return. And I think that's really important, because sometimes you get to the end of an engagement with a customer, that interaction, and the customer may not know what to ask for. And so you can actually prompt them. A lot of my customers that I work with ask for the following as a next step. Would that make sense to you? Right? And so if you've taken the time to prepare, both in terms of thinking what the customer might need and what you might need in return, you then have some of the science to work with. The art is where you put that on the table in front of the customer and it doesn't feel like a negotiation.
I love what you're saying there about the research and the knowledge that you should have going into the conversation. There shouldn't be, in an ideal world, there shouldn't be a question that the client asks that you haven't rehearsed or you're not expecting to be discussed. How do you know? Someone said, like on enterprise, there's only a small number of opportunities they may be doing at once, but if it's commercial mid-market, how do you know how much research to do really early on when your pipeline may not always come to the fruition that you want it to, and you end up spending a lot of time doing research on businesses that don't really go on? So is your take that you just do the research and everything and expect it, or is there a way of working out exactly where to put your efforts in?
I think sort of two responses there, James. One is, on your point about effort, right? I think you need to balance effort with the return. If you're working in a more transactional business and the percentage of quota that a given deal is going to retire is very small, your level of effort into that opportunity ought to be measured. It ought to be balanced. Whereas if you're in enterprise and closing a deal could potentially retire 200% of your number, you might want to be a little bit more thoughtful and intentional about the amount of time and effort you put into researching that company and preparing for those next steps. As I sort of think about your question around researching the company, though, I sort of bifurcate it into into two parts. One is the company research itself. What do they do? What's important to them? Why does it matter? There's a lot of technology today that can help you simplify and shorten the amount of time it takes to really get that understanding as a sales athlete. And things like ChatGPT as an example, there's other tools out there in the market, of course, but you can very quickly ask questions of those applications, and it will synthesize a lot of information in a very short period of time to help you as a seller truly understand the business of the customer whom you're selling to. Now, the second side of research and preparation is really figuring out, where am I in the cycle and what is the appropriate next thing to ask for. Part of that comes with experience and, of course, working with your leadership team as a coach to help you kind of think through that if you're a little bit earlier in your career will be helpful. But also thinking about, sort of the playbooks, right? It's not like you're going to see, if you're working in a transactional business and you sell to 100 different companies in a given year, it's not like you're going to see 100 different scenarios. You might see a small handful of them that repeat themselves over and over again. So that pattern recognition becomes very important as you start to establish the playbook. I know that my customer is going to ask for one of these 5 things. And when they do, I'm prepared to ask for an exchange one of these 5 things. And you start to have that sort of pattern recognition and repetition in terms of how you engage with your customers, which allows you to lower the effort spent on any given one opportunity.
And in your opinion, why do you think it's important that sales reps have followed this chain of events in give take to the point where it comes to negotiation on contracts? Why does that, I don't want to say gives an advantage, but puts the sales rep in a better place than if they hadn't?
Well, if you think about it, a lot of my career has been focused on enterprise and strategic. So typical sales cycles are often multi-year. And when you think about it, you're spending that time teaching your customer a behavioral pattern that they should come to expect when you get to the negotiation of the contract and the commercials. Now, even if you're in a smaller business or a more transactional business and you're working with customers on sales cycles that are measured in weeks or months, the same thing still applies. From conversation number 1, you're teaching them a behavioral pattern that will repeat itself as you get to the negotiation of the commercials and the framework for your agreement. And I think that's really, really important because they're not seeing it for the first time. They know that every time they ask you for something like a price discount or a change in terms in your subscription contract, you're going to ask for something in return because every time prior to that, when they asked for something, you also asked for something in return.
Focusing on enterprise selling just for a moment, how important is it that the seller has met the client before you get to contract selling? Or do you think it's not actually that important?
I think it's extremely important. I think you can be very, very efficient through a screen, and certainly you can build some level of chemistry, rapport, and trust. But if you have an opportunity to meet a customer outside of the digital environment, you can actually meet them face to face in a physical setting. I think you have an opportunity to strengthen that. And the stronger you have a relationship with the customer, the greater your ability to leverage that to understand what's important to them. A lot of times when I start the negotiation, which of course, as I said, starts at conversation number 1, but when we get to the part of the relationship where it's time to now negotiate the commercial framework, understand what the pricing is going to look like, understand what the terms and conditions are going to look like, a lot of times I'll sit down with the customer and I'll say, look, there are things that are important to you. There are also some things that are important to me, and I like to be very transparent about what those are. Here are the things that are important to me as we take the next step into negotiating this agreement. What are the things that are important to you? And some customers will actually share that pretty openly with you, and you can actually collaborate and co-design the commercial framework that supports the partnership going forward. And I think that's a win-win-win, and I'll say 3 wins because the customer wins, the individual, the company that you're selling to wins, and of course, you as the sales athlete hopefully will win too.
Are you willing to share just some of your non-negotiables that you state? What are those things that you put out at the beginning that are like, these are important to me, we're not negotiating on those?
I would say everything is negotiable, James. That said, I do tend to drop some anchors early in the conversation, especially as we get to the discussion around the contract. Working in smaller, mid-sized companies, a lot of times legal resources are somewhat scarce. So negotiating customer paper can be challenging. Not only is it time consuming and expensive for the business that I represent, it can also have a lot of parameters that don't necessarily apply to the business or the products that my team might be selling. And so a lot of times we'll drop an anchor around that. Like we're more than happy to negotiate any terms and conditions in our contract, but our framework is a starting point for any agreement that we put in place. And the reason why is that a lot of the agreements that are part of the organizations that I've been a part of are purpose built for the products and services that are delivered. And so they're tailored based on what those products and services do. versus starting with, sort of a more generic agreement that a lot of large corporates have, which might serve software companies, hardware providers, consumable suppliers, all different types of services for building and facilities and et cetera, right? So it's a very generalized agreement with a lot of parameters that don't apply to the business.
I love that. Particularly like the drop in the anchor phrase there, because it kind of says this is where we want to be. But like you said, everything is negotiable. So how do you get the message across without it sounding too aggressive, particularly if you go first and say, right, this is my non-negotiable, or we can't budge on this. We know you can, but how do you deliver that message? If you're going first, you're not allowing them to say, you're going to say, right, in what way do you deliver it? Is it direct? Do you talk around it? Do you explain it?
It's direct, and also I encourage my teams to explain it. There needs to be a why behind the anchor, right? We can't just drop an anchor and say it has to be on our paperwork, and the customer says, well, why is that? And we say, just because. That doesn't usually get to a great outcome. But when you explain to the customer that we have purpose-built, the framework specifically for the products and services that we deliver to avoid anything that might be in your agreements that don't apply to our business, and ultimately shorten the negotiation time for your team and our team, freeing up resources to go do other things, it's a win-win when you really get under the hood to understand the why. And so it's really, really important that whatever anchors you're going to establish, you explain the why behind it and make sure customers really understand that explanation at all different levels in the negotiation stakeholder group.
How do you coach your reps to understand, particularly when negotiating, and clients will be looking for, let's say, like for easier sake here, the cheapest deal possible? How do you teach your reps to look outside the box and negotiate on different things? So like, for instance, it might be looking on number of licenses that are increased to years in the contract. How do you get your guys to really understand when they're asking for something, what to put across that benefits both parties? Because at the end of the day, people want to walk away from a negotiation table both feeling like they've got something. And what you don't want the rep to be is just walking away with a contract that is signed, which could look better if they just asked a few questions and they could have got something else. So how do you, I guess that's a long-winded way of asking, how do you get the reps to really understand how to maximize their opportunity at that contract negotiation?
I think one of the things that's really, really important is to understand the end game, right? Where is this customer ultimately going over a multi-year journey with your organization through the context of the partnership? Some organizations may have a need to start small within a business unit, within a certain geography, within a department. But over time, they intend to scale the use of the application and be able to provide it to a much wider audience within their business. And so understanding that vision, like where are we going, what's the end game, will help you work back from that destination and figure out how do you structure the commercial framework to support what the customer needs today and what they can afford, and also build a pathway for growth over time, assuming that you and the customer are successful with the investment in the platform. So I think it's really important to get sellers to ask some of those questions, to not just understand what do you need today, but where are you ultimately going with this long term, and how do we shape something that's going to support your needs today as well as into the future, so that you're poised for growth and we're poised to support you along that journey.
And is it important for sales leaders listening that reps are rewarded for that? Because quite often salespeople will behave in a way that how they are, what they earn is what they'll negotiate on. And that extension out can be a way of obviously getting salespeople to look at it. So talking to sales leaders right now about rewarding reps in different ways, how important is that to get them to behave in certain ways in negotiation?
I think it's really important. I mean, at the end of the day, your sales athletes are conditioned to sell based on how their compensation plan is structured, right? So if you're looking for them to perhaps consider future purchase decisions in the context of the initial framework, you need to make sure you're rewarding them for that effort. And so one of the things that we've done in some other companies is structure the compensation plan not to just pay on first year contract value, but to look at the total contract value divided by the number of years that contract is structured for, and it becomes sort of an average ARR across the ramp in that agreement. And that's how we incentivize and reward the salespeople for ensuring that we capture the totality of what the business growth looks like.
Before we move on, I just want to touch on the meeting with the clients. If you go to meet somebody at contract point and you've not met them before, do you think that puts you in a stronger position or a negative position? Because I feel that if you're like, well, I'm only going to come out and see you now, it's only worth it because we're going to be talking on the contract side. I'd be interested to get your view on that.
It's an interesting question. As a revenue leader, I've done both, and I see pros and cons in each case. When you're pulled in, oftentimes at the contract negotiation, you don't have a prior relationship. Your levers are limited. There's only certain things you can draw upon in order to get to a great outcome. And also, sometimes you've reached the point in the negotiation where that's needed, where you need someone to come in. You can call it good cop, bad cop. Maybe I'm the good cop. Maybe I'm the bad cop, depending on where we are on certain elements of the negotiation. But you need someone to come in who's going to make a decision without emotion, without history, without context. They're just going to simply say, this is what we can, or this is what we cannot do in the context of what's being negotiated. In other cases, I found that having the relationship earlier on has enabled me to be able to better have a more transparent conversation with a customer around what's really important to you. We've reached a stalemate on a negotiation for, a particular contract, or maybe they're asking for a discount that at the end of the day is something our business cannot support. What are you really trying to solve for here? What is the primary issue? And sometimes you'll hear things like, well, our budget's not available until after January 1st, and so we don't have access to the funds. Or you hear that we've only budgeted X amount of dollars for this year. Okay, well, what's your budget look like for next year? You start to really get under the hood to understand what are the things that are causing them to ask for the thing that they're asking for in the negotiation. And then you start to structure things differently. It doesn't necessarily mean you have to extend a greater discount and lower your price. In some cases, it means you just need to come up with some creative payment terms. Instead of paying all of it up front, you pay half now, half net 180, or whatever you decide to do for the business to support their budgetary cycle. So sometimes having that relationship earlier enables you to be able to ask some of those more intimate questions, to really get under the hood and figure out, why are they asking for the thing they're asking for, and how can we solve it in a way that's not only a win for the customer, but also a win for us at the same time.
And before we move on, what advice could you give to sales leaders now who can then be observing their sales reps, looking at data to understand if their sales reps are truly negotiating from day one, or just waiting till the end to actually do the negotiating? So you mentioned the give take from the get-go. Are there tools that you use?
Yeah, I think there's two ways you can do that. Today, with all of the technology we have to be able to hear essentially what's happening on the customer calls at scale, you can really start to understand these sellers are asking for things in return. This other group of sellers maybe is not, and that's a training opportunity. But outside of that, I think there's also an opportunity to think about the way that you've structured your sales process. A lot of sales organizations will have a typical process, stage 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, et cetera. And they have certain criteria that need to be met before an opportunity moves from one stage to the next. A lot of times that criteria is based on the point of view that a salesperson has. We've done the demo, check, we move to the next stage. We've completed the business case, check, we move to the next stage. But one of the things that I think is really important is to include what I call customer verifiable outcomes in the sales process. It's actions or behaviors that the customer has to exhibit before an opportunity can move from one stage to the next. So for example, when you want to establish a culture around negotiating early, you could say that in order for something to move from stage 1 to stage 2, the customer has to do the following things in return. And that might be sign an NDA, which is something pretty straightforward. It might be introduce us to an executive sponsor and engage me as the chief revenue officer in order to build that executive bridge. There's different things that you can contemplate at each stage of the sales process, but it's a step the customer has to take on their side before the opportunity can move from one stage to the next. And it sort of reinforces that negotiate from day one culture, because the seller has to ask for those things in return for something the customer might be asking for at that stage in the process.
Thank you for sharing your thoughts on that. I think negotiation can really make a difference in businesses actually achieving their revenue target this year. And I think you stand yourself in a much better position of that win-win if, like you say, you start negotiation early on. So we're moving on to our next topic, creating a winning culture. Now, I love this. I love this because cultures become quite fluffy. Pizza Fridays, beanbags in the office, which doesn't necessarily help you achieve a revenue target. I want to have this conversation around a sales leader joining a business, assessing the situation, build from there. But before we go into that, you mentioned creating a winning culture. What is a winning culture?
For me, a winning culture is one where every member of the team sees the part that they play in the overall success of the organization. They understand what their day in and day out activity does in order to impact success. And I think that's really, really important that you establish those clear lines between all the different functional parts of your business and ultimately the KPIs that are measuring success for the company. And so when you're building a winning culture, I think it's really important not only to make sure each and every person understands where they fit within that hierarchy, but they also celebrate together for each and every success that you achieve.
So a sales leader goes in, they're on day one, they want to create a winning culture. First off, how do they assess in the first 30, 60, 90 days of what the culture actually is at that point?
I think part of it is getting your finger on the pulse of what's happening in the field. You can, of course, do that through, cadence calls that happen on a weekly basis, forecast calls, pipeline reviews, deal reviews, et cetera. You can kind of get a sense for it. But getting out in the field is really where you're going to feel that. You're going to see a different kind of energy in organizations that have built a winning culture and organizations who have not. You'll see a different kind of passion and enthusiasm come through, not only in the way that the sales athletes or other members of the team interact with the customer, but the way that they engage with you as an executive sponsor and preparing you for those calls with the customer. If they bring a high degree of energy and enthusiasm to that conversation, there's probably a winning culture somewhere hidden underneath that. And if they're not, if they're kind of just going through the motions, rinse and repeat, there might be an opportunity to improve in that area.
I always say culture, particularly this time of year, culture's spoken a lot in sales kickoffs. And I always say culture is not a few words on a screen, on a presentation. How do you make sure what is on that screen gets lived daily? What are a couple of key things you could recommend to sales leaders that they should be doing to start embedding that culture?
I think as I sort of think about launching, a new year with a sales organization, winning culture comes from a framework of accountability. And in my point of view, it's a mutual accountability. It's establishing clear expectations for the team that I lead, and also establishing clear expectations for what value I will create for the team that I lead, and holding one another accountable to those expectations. And so as I sort of think about the few words on the slide, it's not so much the few words on the slide that are getting people excited about what we're going to go accomplish in 2026. It's more about what's under the hood and that framework of accountability for here's what I'm going to do for all of you. And in return, back to negotiating, you do that internally as well. Back to negotiating, right? Here's what I expect from you in return for the following investment that I'm going to make in your success. And so once you establish that as a framework and then actually enable every member of the team to hold one another accountable to what those success metrics are, you start to build that winning culture, understanding that, of course, when you are successful, you celebrate, but also understanding that when you fail, when you miss the mark, each and every person on the team takes ownership of that miss. And we turn that failure into a platform of learning and growth, right? There's a lot of stigma in organizations that, oh gosh, I can't possibly fail. That might result in disciplinary, actions, or I might lose my job or position on the team. That should not be a part of a culture when you're trying to build a winning culture. People should be able to lean into their failures and say, hey, I tried something, and you know what? It didn't work. And here's what I learned from that. And hopefully everyone else on the team can benefit from that learning.
So that's, I guess, the only way I can phrase it is it's easy to say that, creating that environment where it's okay to fail in a job where you're measured and paid on success. So how do you prove to people that it's okay to fail before anybody has done it? Because I think that's really important.
Part of it is I think part of it is being vulnerable as a leader. A lot of people will take a look at, any of us as revenue leaders and often see a trajectory of success, right? We've been successful as sales athletes. We've been successful as sales managers. We've now risen to executive level roles. And a lot of people just see this straight line towards a great outcome. But the reality is it's like a bowl of spaghetti, right? All of us have struggled through the ups and downs that come along with being in these roles. And I think when you're able to share some of those stories with the team, let them see where you were successful and also where you struggled and failed and ultimately had a learning opportunity that drove growth. I think that opens the door a little bit for them to also be vulnerable. I think you also need to set the right tone, right? You can't obviously have a team that fails consistently quarter over quarter. That doesn't take anybody to the right result. And also you need to enable there to be room for some level of failure, right? And I redefine failure as learning. I think people need to have the ability to step outside their comfort zone, push their boundaries beyond what they're capable of doing, see what that limit looks like, and then figure out, what did I learn from that, and how do I incorporate that into a successful outcome as we contemplate the next quarter.
I'm one of those that really believe that you have a true culture is when the actions and activities happen when the leader is far, far away from the scene. What key KPIs could you as a leader be looking at that gives you a leading indicator that you have the winning culture? Not the KPIs that say if your pipeline's looking good or you're going to a deal. What could they look at that gives them an idea that they're on the right line, the right path to a winning culture?
I think for me, part of it is when the team celebrates and they initiate the celebration. It's great, of course, if the CRO sees a successful outcome and says, "Hey, we're going to celebrate this win, or we're going to celebrate this renewal that just happened, or we're going to celebrate the expansion of this key account that we've been working with for several years." It's great to be led from the top. It's even, I think, more powerful when it comes from the bottom. When a team sees success, maybe in a smaller capacity or even in a large one, and they bring forward the celebration. They take it upon themselves. They have that initiative. I also think it's interesting when teams try something that maybe is new or innovative. They have a successful outcome, and they also bring that forward. They're not waiting for senior leadership to see it. They're taking it and they're calling their peers across the organization and saying, "Hey, I built this this capability that enabled me to do the following with this customer. It resulted in them paying an extra 25% on their subscription. Give it a try with yours," right? And they start to share that. To me, that's building a winning culture, because the individuals on the team are not just focused on their own successful outcome, they're also interested and focused on the successful outcome of others on the team. And I'll share a really brief story with you going back earlier in my career when I moved into one of my first senior leadership roles. We had a relatively small team, and we were going through a go-to-market transformation. And I stood in front of all of them at the sales kickoff event that year, and I said, my goal, my number one mission this year is to get 100% of this team into President's Club at whatever cost. Like, let's go do it. I want to see you all be successful. And as the year wore on, we saw a lot of great successes. We were winning deals. Teams, the team was capturing business that previously we thought we could not capture. So we were starting to see movement in the right direction. Well, long and behold, we got to the end of the year. We were in December. Everybody has qualified for President's Club except one person on the team. He was about 100K short, and he had a 150K deal left to go. And it was in the bag. It was a current customer. They had already committed budget. They were just working through the formalities of getting the signature. And the customer called us midway through December and said, "I'm really sorry to do this to you, but due to unforeseen circumstances, we won't be able to sign in December. We'll take care of this early in the following year." And so that person was not going to qualify for President's Club. Once that information was shared on a forecast call, I had another seller come forward the following afternoon. And that seller said, "Hey, I know that person is, going to miss the mark on President's Club. I actually have another deal that I still think I'm going to close before the end of the year. If I'm successful and I get it across the line, is there any way to give it to that other person? I don't really need the quota relief. I've already qualified for President's Club. And it's really important to me as an individual on this team that the whole team is there to celebrate." And I just thought that was an incredible milestone in the development of a winning culture with that team. That individual was not just concerned about their own performance, but was really, truly, and genuinely concerned about the overall performance of the team. And I think those are the kinds of maybe intangible things that you measure when you start to see individuals take interest in the success of a team, not just the success of themselves.
When you told me that story when we were preparing, I loved it. It's not often you hear that. But just to challenge you on it slightly, if that is the measure stick, the yardstick of a winning culture, you only had one person offer it. So if the others didn't, would it suggest that one person is bought into the winning culture and the other aren't? Or am I being pernickety?
I think that was a pretty unique situation. I don't know of other sellers who would necessarily come forward and give away their own commissions, or potentially at the end of the day, we gave sales credit to both sellers and rewarded them both with commissions. But when they made the ask, they didn't know that, right? And so I think that that's pretty rare. I don't think you find that in a sales athlete that often. And I think it's sort of an extreme case of demonstrating that a winning culture was built. But like I said, I think when you're looking across the team throughout the course of the year, not in the context of maybe something that that extreme, but you start to see individuals sharing their success with others. They've built something that worked for them. They share it with the rest of the team. For me, it's the same thing. Maybe the risk, so to speak, from a individual performance or individual income perspective is not as high when you're sharing a spreadsheet or a template or a PowerPoint that you built. But it's the same concept, right? You see individuals starting to take interest in team success, not just in their own success.
And just to really try and understand your thought process on what a winning culture, because you've spoken a lot there about teams. I personally think teams are only as strong as all the people in there. But also, I talk to a lot of great salespeople, and there are still those salespeople that hit their number. They're really good at what they do, but do they care what anyone else is doing? No. Do they even care if the company hits the number? They would probably say yes, but they'll be like, as long as I hit my number, and they do a great job. They're professional in everything that they do, but they're not going to get a call and talk about what they're doing. They're not going to share their problems with anybody. Is there a place for that person within a winning culture? And are we sacrificing revenue if we don't include them, or are we risking not having the right culture?
I think it's a delicate and nuanced answer to your question. When you have a high performer who's essentially a lone wolf, oftentimes they're delivering the number in spades, right? So they're a key contributor to the overall success of the company. And you could argue, in some respect, the success of the team. Maybe they're not contributing to the overall team dynamic and the winning culture, but they are putting numbers on the board that help the team get to an outcome that allows us to grow and continue to invest in the team that's on the field. So on the one hand, there's some positives that come along with it. Now, my experience is that a lot of the lone wolves also come with some negatives. They're not just the person who's out there crushing their number and just happens to be kind of on their own. They're also the person who's draining the organization of many resources. They're often the person who's coming to the organization and saying, I lost the deal because all of you people didn't do what I needed you to do. And they point their finger when they don't win. And they're often coming to the organization, challenging the business to over-invest in their success. And so putting more resources behind them, which in their mind is justified because they're performing, but is draining resources from the ability to support and make successful the rest of the team. And of course, if you have a sales team with 100 people, if you have 3 people doing well, that's great. But if you have 30 people doing extremely well, that's a lot better, right? And so unfortunately, I've seen most of those lone wolves come with sort of the negative detractors as well. And that's where I would answer your question in much the same way that you did, which is those are probably people you need to find a way out of the business over time. Whereas if they're just simply a lone wolf and they're hitting their numbers, maybe they're not meshing with the culture fully. But if they're not, damaging the business, if they're not hurting and harming other people, if they're not overly consuming resources, I would say you might still have a place for them within the team. Maybe carving them out into a separate part of the business focused on strategic accounts or key customers. There might be different ways in which you can shape their role to allow them to have success as a lone wolf with the business, so long as they're not harming the business along the way.
And how many of those can you afford to have? Let's say you've got 30 sellers. How many of those nice lone wolves can you afford to have in the business to maintain the culture that you're looking for?
In a team as small as 30, you probably cannot afford to have more than one. And even that is probably a challenge, right?
And do you admit to the other people that this person is a lone wolf? Do you ignore it and just carry on and talk about culture all the time, or do you hit it head on and say, look, I understand that a certain person isn't into this, but that's okay?
It depends, in my opinion, on how visible their deviation from what you're asking the rest of the team to do becomes. So, for example, if you're asking the team to update their notes in your CRM weekly, and this person is habitually not putting any information into CRM, you're essentially telling the rest of your team it's okay because you're keeping that person on the team, right? And so I think you have to be thoughtful about what kind of message is being sent to the rest of the team if that person is not, sort of doing what the rest of the team is expected to do. That said, if they're simply a lone wolf, but they are updating the CRM and they are doing all the things that you're asking them to do, they just happen to kind of operate on their own. I think there's a way to accommodate that within the team structure and not completely derail what you're trying to build from a winning culture perspective.
100%. I also think with all the tools available now, updating the CRM is a non-negotiable, really, isn't it? Well, look, it's a tricky subject. I really appreciate you sharing your thoughts with us on that. I also think it's really important now, even more so now, where I think sales teams aren't generally going to be smaller than what they have been in the past. And everybody needs to come together, pull together to get the revenue that's required. And they should be helping and sharing insight and information. So thank you so much for sharing your thoughts on that. The final subject is obviously a subject close to my heart, selecting winners. Now, I want to just focus on that interview process and understanding what the winners look like, because I think it's an area where a lot of sales leaders struggle to actually really know what they're trying to identify and look for. So as a way of kicking off, how do you, in an interview process, what are one or two questions that you're looking to ask to understand if you've got a winner in front of you? And what are the answers you're looking for?
Yeah, it's really interesting because a lot of people focus the interview cycle on past experience. They will, obviously look at the resume from a screening perspective. Has that person worked in similar companies? Have they had a track record of success with their performance? All those sorts of things. And then in the interview cycle, they'll ask questions about that. Tell me about your biggest deal. Tell me about a time when you lost a deal. And all of that is interesting. But at the end of the day, your past performance is not always a very good predictor of your future performance. And so I find that it's really important to dig into the qualities of the person, not just on their performance and their experience. And so as I sort of thought about my 25 years in go-to-market, there were sort of three qualities that rose to the surface across all of the top sales athletes I've ever had the pleasure of working with. One was curiosity. They are genuinely interested in trying to understand how businesses work and what problems they have. The second is creativity. They're very, very good problem solvers. They can actually make the square peg fit into the round hole because they're really good at figuring out how to shape things for an outcome that both they and the customer need. And then the last is grit. They are absolutely relentless in finding a pathway to success. We know this as sales athletes. We're told no on a regular basis. That is just part of the job. And also finding a pathway to a great outcome for you and for the customer is also the job, right? And these are the kind of people who will persevere. They'll push through all of that no matter how many times they hear it cannot be done, and they'll still find a way to get it done. And so when I think about interviewing and selecting winners, I look for people who have curiosity, creativity, and grit. And I ask them questions to demonstrate examples of where they needed to have curiosity, they needed to show creativity, they needed to be good problem solvers, et cetera, or they needed to persevere through a difficult situation and really demonstrate their grit.
So I love those 3 points. And I think the hardest ones to really get under the hood on is curiosity and resilience. So let's focus in there on curiosity. When you're asking someone to show that they've been curious, salespeople are very good at show and tell, and they will give you an answer that you're looking for. So how do you get under the hood to actually demonstrate if this person's just spinning you a yarn or is genuinely curious?
2 parts to answer your question. The first is the questions that I ask and analysis of the responses that I get. A lot of times I'll ask a seller to tell me about a deal. When I'm talking about ICs, sales athletes on the field, tell me about a recent deal that you won, tell me about a recent deal that you lost. And a lot of times after they get done telling me their story, I'll say, tell me a little bit more about how you found that opportunity. How did you decide to call on that customer? How did you find the person that you called on? How did you ultimately get that person to take a call with you? How did you get that person to take a next step with you, right? So I really kind of unpack that because it demonstrates some level of curiosity based on the responses you get. Well, I spent time on the company website. I looked at their 10K. I used ChatGPT. I went to LinkedIn. I did this. I sent this outreach. You can start to see this is a creative person with a lot of curiosity, or this is someone who's ticking the boxes and sending generic emails out to 1,000 people every hour, right? And so for me, you can kind of test a little bit of that in the context of the story they tell around a particular deal. But I also look at it at the end of the interview. I always save time for them to ask questions of me. And I'm fascinated with how many people don't have any questions. You get to the end of the interview, and you say, okay, what questions do you have for me today? And they say, well, I already looked at your website, so I've got a pretty good idea of what you do. And I don't really have any questions today. Okay, this person has zero curiosity. If I had an opportunity to ask questions of a senior leader in a business I was going to join, I could spend hours, right? And so for me, it's another way of sort of a litmus test in terms of whether or not this person is bringing the right kind of curious mind to the table that you want as a sales athlete on the team.
So true. That questioning at the end is a critical test on it. And have they been listening throughout the interview, and then have the questions. Also, I love what you spoke about. The second, third, and fourth question are the important questions. The first question sets it up, and then you get under the bonnet, and it's that second, third, and fourth question that gets you the real answer. How important would you stress to sales leaders that curiosity or any key traits that you're looking to interview for, it's not about the question you ask for them to demonstrate, it's what you ask after they've given you the initial story?
Well, I think it's so fundamental to what we do as sales athletes in the discovery process with a customer. And I like to bring that to light. It should apply in the interview process as well, right? All of the sales leaders that have been a part of my teams, they do a great job at coaching their teams through customer discovery, how to ask the question, how to ask the why behind the question and the why behind the why and so forth. And you keep digging, essentially looking for how painful is the pain and how important is it to solve the problem, right? And so that's what good discovery is all about. I ask my sales leaders to do the same thing in the interview process. Don't just ask the question and tick the box that they gave you an answer and told you a story about a deal. Get under the hood, understand the why. Why did you call on that customer? Why did you call on that persona? Why did that persona respond to you? Just keep digging. And that level of discovery will help you surface whether or not you have a person with a curious mind or you have a person who's kind of going through the motions.
And then resilience. This is a really, really hard character trait, because it's not a skill set. It's a character trait to unhash if someone is truly resilient. And a lot of people, they will ask about where they can show where they've been resilient. Particularly in sales, sometimes people will go to a sporting or a college situation. And I've spoken to many incredible sporting athletes who are not high performing salespeople, but they have been super resilient in a cup final of something or other, and you'll think, right, this person's got it all. There's a difference between resilience in a hobby and resilience in business. What are the questions that you're asking to really demonstrate if somebody has the resilience?
I'll often ask people to take me through scenarios where their business was not performing at the level that they need for success, whether that's from a pipeline generation and maturation perspective, whether that's from deal progression and actually moving opportunities through the sales process at the speed that they need, whether that's actually in the closing cycle. A lot of times we're told no at various stages during the final contract negotiation and closing of the opportunity. And so I'll ask them to take me through different scenarios that will help me understand how they pushed through the obstacles early stage, mid stage, and late stage on an opportunity to see if they've had some of that situational experience. Sometimes if I'm not super clear on what level of resilience they have in the context of a business setting, I won't say that I ghost them, but let's just say I get a little quiet on my responses when they're following up. And I see, are they really interested in this opportunity? Are they going to pursue me? Right. And it's not an ego thing. It's truly about, are they willing to press through the obstacle that I've just put in front of them? It's a test to see if they're able to kind of overcome that obstacle and find a great path forward. It's interesting because some sellers will take a very positive direction with that. Hey, I understand you're probably traveling, you're very busy, you're a senior leader, would love to get some more time with you for the following reasons. They keep a very positive energy around their pursuit, whereas others might say something like, it's been 3 days, I haven't heard from you. Clearly, I'm not the right person. Well, maybe you're not. And we move on, right? And so I don't like to use that all the time, and sometimes I don't have to, but in some cases, it's an effective tool to really understand, is this person, they might have told some great stories, but are they really walking the walk, or is it simply talking the talk?
It's interesting. How do you record all this information? Are you a scorecard leader? And who is involved in the interview process? Who's identifying these characteristics and skill sets? Are you doing it all yourself, or have you got other people in your leadership team taking on part of it?
Definitely use scorecards. And I also like to put thought into the role that each stakeholder plays in the interview process. I don't think it's useful for us or for the candidate to have 5 people interview the candidate and all ask the same questions or seek, kind of insights into the same characteristics or performance. And so I try to segment, the evaluation into different buckets, and then each person has their own bucket to explore. That sort of answers your question about the involvement of others. I do bring in a team. I like to usually work with 3 to 5 people, depending on the role and its complexity, to really make sure I have a sound view on the candidate, and also the candidate has a sound view on our business. In terms of, identifying, what does the ideal candidate profile look like, putting together the characteristics we're going to look for, building the buckets that we're going to test for through the interview process. I do some of that on my own because I enjoy it. And also, I do work with my HR business partners and my talent advisors. They certainly help me shape some of that. And in some cases, I'm even pulling in people from the interview committee. I've got 5 people on the team. What do you think we should be testing for in the context of this particular role? And sometimes they'll have some interesting insights that I may have not thought about.
I'm putting you on the spot here. You probably weren't expecting this question. Is the scorecard an indicator or a hard yes or no?
It's an indicator for me. I don't use it as a hard yes, no. There have been a few times in my lifetime where I've taken a chance on someone and it's worked out incredibly well. And I think I'm probably more open to that than some revenue leaders, because at different stages in my career, people took a chance on me too. I didn't have the experience. I didn't have the proof that I could actually do the job at the level that was needed. And somebody saw something in me and said, I'm going to take a chance on this person anyway. And so sometimes a scorecard might tell me, maybe this person isn't exactly the person we would normally want to bring in, but I see something special in that individual. And I know that through some coaching and mentoring and a little bit of development, that person is highly motivated and they're going to go do some amazing things. We just need to arm them with the right tools and give them the right support to realize their full potential. Sometimes you can be wrong in that, but most of my bets have been pretty good.
So I mean, look, even using scorecards, it's not a fail-safe option. But you mentioned their skills, which I think is interesting. Let's look at your 3 points that you mentioned at the start: resilience, creativity, and curiosity. They're characteristics. If they don't have all 3 of those ticked, are they a no or are they a maybe? And if they're a maybe, which of the 3 can you do without?
It's a great question. Skills can be taught. And a lot of times a candidate may not have all the skills that you're looking for in an ideal candidate profile, but they can be taught. Abilities are much, much harder to teach. Either you have them or you don't. And even though some people can, quote unquote, learn a quality, you can learn to be curious. At the end of the day, if you're not a curious person, you're not. You're faking it every day you go to work and you have to pretend to be curious, right? And so my point of view is those are non-negotiable. If you're not a curious person, if you don't have creativity and problem solving skills, and if you don't have the tenacity, the grit, the perseverance to get to success, regardless of the obstacles in front of you, you're probably not going to be a successful person on the team.
I totally agree with you on that. And when we were talking before in planning this podcast, you mentioned about getting people to fail fast. And it's not always on the lips of a sales leader. I think is absolutely the right way to go about it. But when you're talking about getting someone to fail fast, what do you mean? And how is that onboarding process set up to make sure that you do fail? If it's going to fail, get it done quickly.
Yeah, one of the things I've done well with my revenue enablement leaders is build out a competency framework that can really help us not only enable the talent as they come into the organization, but also assess the talent as they're onboarding. And the idea behind that is over the course of a 90-day period, rather than sort of the classic and traditional enablement program where you throw everyone in a conference room for a week or 2 weeks and kind of jam everything into their head and set them off into the world and hope they're going to remember all of it. Instead, we take an approach where we sort of spoon feed information or knowledge to the sales athlete as they need it. So for example, in week 1, you probably don't know you don't need to know how to build a quote in your CRM system, but maybe by week 6 or week 8, that becomes something that's important. And so we're sort of timing the delivery of information based on when the sales athlete is going to need it most. And as we're doing that, we're assessing and evaluating their ability to not only understand what's being shared with them, but their ability to apply. And so we're putting them into sort of real world scenarios where we can score their performance on a particular competency, and then also arming their leaders with the same tools so that as they venture out into the field and they start to demonstrate these competencies in a customer setting, we can score that as well. And the idea behind it isn't that, if you get a bad score, you're off the team. There's obviously opportunities to develop and continue to enable people. But if we see that there's major gaps in this ability, this person's ability to be successful in our model, it's an opportunity for us to fail fast and just say, look, you're 90 days in, you're missing on, 7 of the 9 competencies in our framework. What do you think your ability is to be successful here? How do you feel after 90 days? And what's really interesting is that a lot of sales athletes will actually be pretty honest about that. And they'll say, this has been hard. This doesn't feel good. I go home every night and I can't sleep. Okay, well, let's work on a transition plan that makes sense for you and for our business. And it doesn't necessarily mean that, they're out the door that afternoon. It means that this wasn't the right role for them at this stage of our growth. Perhaps there's another role inside the business that's a better fit for them. And if not, let's help them transition to a role where they can be successful somewhere outside of the company.
I think this is super interesting. And I want to dive more into this framework. What's in that framework and what thought process gone in to put it into the framework?
The framework's not really a one size fits all. Each business might have some nuance in what the framework is, but essentially the framework is looking at your sales skills, your people skills, your technical competency around what the product does, how it does it, kind of a gamut of different things that you need to go be an effective sales leader. Business acumen probably being one of the most important. And it doesn't necessarily mean you have to be a domain expert on the space and the problem that we solve with the technology from our company. It just means that you have an ability and capacity to go learn that, right? And some of that's not only about the ability and capacity, but also the willingness to go learn it, because some people say, I'm just not willing to learn a new thing. And so we build out a framework. Usually it has, somewhere between 5 and 10 different competencies that you're going to look at, and it has different levels of maturity within those competencies. You don't have to be the most mature in all competencies to be successful on the team. And also you need to be committed to continuing to develop in those competencies to be able to be successful on the team long term. Establishing that framework, I think, really helps us not only assess talent through the interview cycle, but as we're going through the onboarding process in those initial 90 days, really get a sense for who's going to be a high performer, who's potentially not going to be a high performer, and are we going to invest in those people to get them to a different performance level, or are we going to just agree that it's not going to be a good fit?
And who's responsible for implementing the framework, and who is responsible for monitoring it, not just waiting until you get to 90, 100 days, whatever is the cutoff point for you?
I think it's a shared responsibility. At the end of the day, the owner of the framework has been my enablement team. They're the ones who kind of put it together. They develop all the curriculum underneath it. They put the scoring mechanisms in place. They put some of the early warning sensors out into the field that can help detect through data whether or not a seller is performing at a particular level in a competency. So some of that is with the enablement team. But that said, it's truly shared ownership. They own it, as well as our talent management organization, as well as the first line managers. I mean, at the end of the day, they cannot be successful if the members of their team are not successful. And part of the measurement and the evaluation of the talent sits with the first line manager. So it's really a shared framework. But the creation of it and the tuning of it really has sat with enablement for me in the past.
How would you stress the importance of a framework to sales leaders? Because I can see the point of the framework is to make people fail fast. But the upside of it is that you're going to get people ramped quicker, up to speed, bringing in revenue. So the plus points far outweigh the negative part to it. And you probably have less failure at that point because of the framework that you have in place. So before I let you go, what would you say to sales leaders who don't have that type of framework in place, why they should?
I think it's an invaluable instrument in helping you navigate a team towards a successful outcome. And what's interesting is that most sales leaders that I've worked with are thrilled to have it. Many organizations don't invest in that level of science. And once you have it, regardless of how they feel about an individual seller, they don't want people on the team who can't be successful. It doesn't mean they're not a good person. It just means in our model at this stage of growth, that person is not going to be able to be successful. And the manager doesn't want that either. So whether you're looking at it through the lens of fail fast, or you're looking at it through the lens of how do we develop our talent into our future leaders for the business, either way, the management teams have been very supportive and have welcomed the science to really understand what's going on with the people on their team.
Joe, we've gone over our allotted timescale, but I always enjoy talking to you. There's always so much great insight from the incredible career that you've had so far. So thank you so much for stopping by and having this conversation with us.
Thank you, James. It was a pleasure speaking with you today, and I really appreciate the discussion. Thank you.